let's be clear. Bolsonaro is backed by a beef caucus that encourages practices like setting fire of the Amazon to clear land for beef and cattle. He has shown very little resistance change internally in Brazil despite environmental action. The only thing that Bolsonaro literally cares about is economic productivity and economic growth. The only way to actually make Bolsonaro change, to make him falter, to make it easier for people and to stop these destructive practices is to have external pressure that hurts Brazil's economy enough to be able to make it change, and for Bolsonaro's interests to finally be about the Amazon and be about the people of Brazil. 3 issues then in our speech. Firstly, about why this is necessary, secondly, about why this will change the economy, and thirdly, about the benefits to other trading partners. But first, on why this is necessary. Fairly obviously, we think there are principled reasons why it is immoral to do things like actively burn the Amazon rainforest, things like harm to indigenous people, things like how because the Amazon is 20% of the world's oxygen, you're literally just condemning people to death in the future, things like how it is a carbon sink trap and therefore burning the Amazon literally means climate change is more likely, things like how indigenous people are literally being slaughtered as a result of these practices. These are all legitimate principled reasons why it is immoral to do things that actively make the Amazon worse and why you should probably consider stopping those sort of actions. But importantly, why it is necessary specifically in Brazil's interests, why we need to do this to make Brazil change. First thing to say is, Brazil has been rather resistant internally, as I've already indicated, and we think that external pressure is what would make you change. No, thank you. Bolsonaro has been widely condemned by other people in terms of how he's a massive person anti-environmentalist. But no, we think that changes in Brazil's economy would do things either one of two things. Firstly, if he wants to be re-elected and he wants to be able to have continual growth, he's likely to do things like actively change his policies and make them better for people, or put in regulations. But no, if he does not put in regulations and that sort of stuff, I think it means that it is enough of the scrutiny and people care about the economic growth as well, that he's likely to not be elected in the next election, which would obviously then also be a benefit in terms of then someone who was appointed will probably care more about the Amazon than he did. Then secondly though, why this would change the economy in good ways. First thing to say, no thank you, is that fairly obviously, Brazil would have to do one of two things. It would either have to obviously change to alternatives like have it looking after the Amazon, or it would do things like focus on the services industry that is up and growing at the beginning of Brazil's economy and could easily be a strong thing if they are leaning towards being able to have a competitive advantage in it, which means that they would be able to diversify it in the future. That means that, Bolsonaro has historically been anti the service industry because he is held hostage by the beef industry, which means he focuses on beef and soy production instead of things that would actually be in Brazil's economic interests in the future, which means it is not only harming Brazil in terms of economic growth, this policy would do both help economically, but also help in terms of environmental. No, thank you. The next thing then to say is that we think that the pressure for economically would be really useful. Like the main trading partners of Brazil, like China, like the US, and like South America more broadly, are people who are massively anti the Amazon being destroyed. It is massively important to Peru and Argentina that the Amazon remains because it has important rivers and important structures. But also China has shown caring about environment in the future. It has an emissions trading scheme, and they are leaning towards actively being more environmental. But also note we are likely to also be able to empower environmentalists more broadly in the Brazilian landscape to make and empower those people politically, which is also probably a benefit. I think the next thing to say, no thank you, is that fairly obviously the actors the trading partners probably do want to continue trading with Brazil, and I think they're they're stopping trading stuff like that. Also does things like promote good incentives to help Brazil in terms of putting out fires and try and help them more environmentally in terms of aid, which is also probably good for them in terms of economic advantage and growth in the long term. I'll take Kevin.
Every country in the world needs beef, timber and soy. Why would the immediate reaction of the Brazilian government be just to export these same materials to other countries with worse environmental practices?
Yeah, okay, cool. So I think the first thing to say is that fairly obviously you exporting it to other countries with worse environmental actions isn't really a harm or benefit, it's just something that could happen. I think the exporting of it is not really a problem. The problem is actually now we give Brazil a direct incentive to stop doing this, and the reason why is about what I'm about to say right now. 3 reasons. The first thing to say is that Brazil has a huge incentive to want to be able to trade with China and the US for the reason that it often imports a lot of the materials that US and China manufacture, which is why it is hugely important for them to have good trading relationships in terms of how it is often bilateral and often gives them benefits as well, which means that if they are unlikely and able to import, it actually does harm them in terms of what they can also benefit. The second thing to say, no thank you, is that also it is incredibly important and probably likely that these countries already have good trade deals with Brazil, and their act of not being able to trade with them is super useful because it does things like immobilize the beef, like, the anti, sort of vegetarian industry in the US to do things like focus instead of beef production on other alternatives. It does things like actually make those alternatives more viable because it is now more economically profitable, and now, they have to find another trade resource they're likely to be able to diversify there. Yeah, actually, I'll take that.
This burning closely resembles the land clearing engaged in by colonizers for most of colonial history. In that context, doesn't this resemble a radical act of reclamation by activists seeking to decolonize land norms?
Absolutely not. Then this is like what the hell? Indigenous people in Brazil are being killed by the land clearing of Bolsonaro. They're being killed by the fires that are happening. This is nonsense, but have fun with that extension. Okay, but next on to why other trading partners would get better. Firstly, obviously, we've already given a principled incentive as to why they like to do this, and say that these countries are likely to be continuing becoming more environmental. This also does things like have a signaling effect to other countries about how it is no longer probably going to be economically profitable for you to focus on resources like mining, because mining is now being phased out by the big countries. It's likely to be harder in the future, and that means you're less likely to have incentives to build giant mines if, in 10 years' time, or in the sooner, they are no longer going to be any profitable. It's likely they will then make a decision calculus to not do those sort of activities. The next thing then to say is it also makes these countries able to diversify their industries in better ways. It makes them focus on more renewables that is useful. The third thing then I'd say is, even if they prove that countries are going to trade with other countries, that Brazil, will just not trade with China and the US, or they will not trade with Brazil, that is still a win, because it doesn't matter if China and the US trade with Chad. It matters about the Amazon rainforest with 20% of the world's oxygen. It matters way more about the Brazilian Amazonian rainforest, which will destroy and contribute to climate change way more significantly than any sort of other environmental platform, which is why it's specifically bad for Brazil to be the one that is traded with, even if the environmental, harm of degradation still exists in other countries. It is especially bad it happens in Brazil, which is why this also should not stand there. At the end of my speech, firstly, we think there is a principal necessity to do this, and Bolsonaro will not change without it. We're so proud to go.
Development can't be built overnight. It requires large injections of capital from wealthy countries like the United States, investment from corporations which have technologies which allow Brazilians to pursue agriculture without the need for environmentally destructive practices such as large-scale land clearing. And that is precisely what you lose when you restrict the current trading partners of Brazil's ability to trade with Brazil. I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. They will be very simple. The first is, what is the status quo improving? And the second is why this will not work. Firstly, on why the status quo is improving. There are broadly three reasons. Firstly, corporations have extremely large natural incentives when they are based in the West to protect the Amazon. Firstly, for the reason that corporations generally suffer extremely large reputational damage when they are seen as complicit in the destruction of what is known to many people as the lungs of the earth, particularly if they are based in the major trading partners of Brazil, like China and the United States, which are increasingly characterized by a growing middle class of conscientious consumers who have the money and capital available to differentiate between environmentally friendly and non-environmentally friendly products. Secondly, for the reason that it's in the long term unsustainable for corporations to engage in environmentally destructive practices such as large-scale land clearing, for the reason that it encourages things like the topsoil to blow away from the land that is cleared. And that means that in 5 years, after large swathes of land are cleared, those farms no longer become profitable because you can't grow crops on them. And the reason that that is unlikely to continue in the future is because increasingly, as corporations invest in Brazil to do things like farm beef or to farm soy, they will engage in alternative practices which they have access to by virtue of technology. Thirdly, for the reason that they have access to, that for instance, increasingly the world is dominated by capital restrictions, such as those implemented by international trade organizations, which require a certain commitment, for instance, use that capital to engage in things like green funding or green spending. Secondly, in terms of the individual countries' incentives to trade with Brazil. Firstly, the conglomerate of Southern American countries that currently trade with Brazil obviously have enormous incentives to push the Bolsonaro government towards increasing environmental regulation, for the reason that they, firstly, feel the immediate effects of things like large-scale burn-offs at the Amazon rainforest, when water pollution flows downstream into their countries, or the air pollution blocks out the sun into Argentina. And secondly, the reason that there are obviously extremely large political incentives are incumbent upon those governments for those very reasons to implement those reforms and to exert pressure internationally. Secondly, for the reason that countries like China and the US, as we demonstrated already, is characterized by an increasingly middle class, and by opening government's own admission, are characterized increasingly by increasingly stringent environmental regulations, such as the development of emissions trading schemes in China and regulations on, for instance, the amount of land that you're allowed to burn off for palm oil if you're talking about palm oil imports into the United States. And
Point.
thirdly, the general thing we would suggest here is that the continued political interaction which is allowed by trade, that is the fact that, for instance, corporations need to engage with corporations in Brazil to negotiate trade practices or farming practices, or the fact that you continue to have diplomatic relations on a more constant basis when you continue to engage in trade with those countries, is what allows those incentives that are incumbent upon corporations and countries to be manifested in the way that they are kind of the more powerful party in that relationship, since be China and the US, to engage in that trade relationship and exert their influence in a positive way. I'll prefer one from closing if you have one.
Yeah, so this is just empirically ridiculous. The countries that surround Brazil in South America are all poor and want things at the lowest prices rather than the most environmental. And the US is headed by Donald Trump, who belongs to a party that doesn't believe in climate change. What are you talking about here?
I mean, so firstly, none of that responds to the stuff about corporations and why they have individual incentives to make sure better environmental practices are regulated. Secondly, it is not true that Southern American countries are as poor and destitute as Marcus claims. Argentina is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It has enormous economic power to exert leverage over Brazil. Thirdly, the reason that even if the country is headed by Donald Trump, that is true, but there are a significant number of lawmakers who are kind of, not Donald Trump, right? The House, for instance, it's dominated by Democrats who I believe in climate change. Large numbers of corporations, because they exert power over political parties in the US and also have the same incentives that I've already described, will exert pressure to exist on those. Yes, it is true that Amazon rainforest is currently burning, yeah? Our point is that naturally, in the future, that is likely to be ameliorated. Our second argument will explain why this will not work and make things worse. Firstly, Brazil will just export to other countries. The beef and soy international markets are extremely large, and Brazil will counter to the weird assertion of open government, not just be able to switch overnight to a service industry that is woefully underdeveloped, that doesn't have the money to do so. It is far more likely that it will persist with the huge agricultural industry that dominates its internal market. That means that Brazil's likely alternative will be exporting to countries like Russia or in more impoverished nations, which means the likely outcome are threefold. Firstly, those countries tend to have far worse environmental regulations. Secondly, it cuts prices for those goods for the reason that Brazil has a significantly more restricted market to sell those goods to, which means you have less room to invest in costly environmental practices that might otherwise save the environment, that might otherwise be effective in saving the Amazon. And thirdly, those countries are significantly more likely to be exploitative in their ability to secure those low prices by, for instance, insisting that companies do not engage in beneficial environmental practices because of their the imperfections in bargaining power. Secondly, this hugely empowers the Bolsonaro government in two ways. Firstly, it empowers anti-environmentalist rhetoric, which currently is the reason that the Amazon rainforest is burning. Because Bolsonaro engages in the rhetoric that says that environmentalists are the ones responsible for setting the Amazon rainforest on fire, and that precise rhetoric is what will be justified when now Bolsonaro can point the Brazilian citizens that he governs to the enormous conspiracy on the behalf of the West to force Brazilians to give up their own rights in the name of sacrificing for purely Western benefits. And secondly, that means that there's far less likely to be organically domestic environmental policy. Secondly, we would suggest that it makes Bolsonaro far more likely to remain in power in the long term. Firstly, for the reason that short-term economic downturn is beneficial to populist politicians like Bolsonaro, because it's very easy to justify his strongman position in the country if he can blame that short-term economic downturn on the interference of the West when it no longer allows countries to buy Brazilian goods freely. And the opening government's assertion is he requires continual growth. No, he doesn't. Bolsonaro has implemented an enormous swathe of economic policies like protectionist tariffs on trade that diminish the amount of economic growth in Brazil. Far more likely that so long as there's someone that he can blame, he'll pursue that. And secondly, we would suggest that this empowers the broad anti-globalist rhetoric that he engages in, which suggests that Brazil is constantly under threat of foreign intervention by foreign powers. And that is the worst possible outcome, because every additional term that Bolsonaro or the far right in Brazil secures is an additional term in which the environmental regulations that Brazil desperately needs are not implemented. Finally, we suggest that this means that the long-term trajectory of economic development is broadly harmed in Brazil. The ability to switch to a service industry is reliant upon a large trade surplus, which you only get when you're able to freely export large amounts of agricultural goods overseas at high prices, which is something that this absolutely cuts off out of place.
Hannah, I think one of trading partners of Brazil has implemented their own environmental policies as Kevin claimed, it is principally consistent for these countries to stop trading with Brazil, who is actively destroying Amazon, which is the heart of the earth. And this is why I think they should do it. So 3 issues in the debate. Firstly, why the alternatives are not going to work. Secondly, how they're going to help the environment. And thirdly, why it's going to improve Brazil's political landscape as well. So on to firstly, why the alternatives are not going to work. Firstly, we already told you that Bolsonaro is really, really bad. He's backed up by these like beef and big corporations, and it runs on a platform of economics and economic growth, which means there is no internal incentive for Bolsonaro to change under any circumstances, because he cannot back up on his promise. But when there's external pressure, like on Bolsonaro, and when there's like actual threats on the economy that he is promising his people, we think there is incentive for him to change. Kevin gave you 2 responses. The first response is that, under the status quo, we have projects from neighboring countries. Firstly, these are not mutually exclusive. These neighboring countries can still access a pressure under our set house. And secondly, we're just giving Brazil more pressure, which is like appropriate under these circumstances, given that Brazil is not changing under the status quo, which means Brazil needs more pressure, which means we should cease trading with Brazil. The second response from Kevin is that all the corporations have an incentive to reform under the status quo. Firstly, it is just like not true factually, especially given that the corporation actually giving money to Bolsonaro to destroy the Amazon. Secondly, we think that under the status quo, like if the incentive provided by Kevin is that, they change under the status quo for their trade reputations, which means we give them more incentive to change under our side of the house when they cannot trade literally because of their practices and because they do not implement reform, which means we just give the government and give these corporations more pressure to reform, and they will respond more quickly as well. So we can co-op all their benefits, but at a faster rate. On the second issue, why we're going to help the environment. Firstly, we told you that Brazil either let Bolsonaro adapt to implement regulations and put out the fire and have like more environmental policies, or people are not going to elect Bolsonaro anymore, because people elected Bolsonaro on the premise that he promised economic growth, which means when he cannot deliver his economic growth, these people are not going to vote for him in the future elections, which means Bolsonaro is probably will implement change, and this term, like the future candidates will be like more environmentally friendly than Bolsonaro, which means we're going to protect the environment in this way. Secondly, we think that Brazil is going to diversify its economy from agriculture to services industry as well, which means they just like destroy less Amazon in the long term, which is also good for Brazil in the long term. So this is why we're going to help the economy. Kevin gave you several responses. Kevin is like, but Brazil is just going to export these like products to other countries. The response is twofold. Firstly, we think that other countries are unlikely to trade with Brazil, especially when US and China and all the powerful neighboring countries say publicly, internationally, we're not going to trade with Brazil because this is bad. And when all the powerful countries align together and say, we are going to stop trading with Brazil, it is very hard for other small countries to say, actually, we are going to trade with Brazil, because it's seen as going against US, going against China, which will damage the international relations of these small countries, which means other countries are probably not going to trade with Brazil in the future as well. Secondly, we think that Brazil is unlikely to trade with other countries, even if other countries want to trade with Brazil, because under the status quo, the current trading partners of Brazil are really big economies and powerful countries in the world, for example, US and China, which means it is in Brazil's interest to maintain a good relationship, especially trading relationship with these countries, which means Brazil is not going to trade with other countries to sabotage the existing relationship with China and with US, especially given that the new trading partners are less powerful and less rich than the current trading partners as well, which means even if Brazil trade with other partners, Brazil will just get less money in the long term, which means it is in Brazil's interests to actively reform and implement environmental policies and to have a good relationship with these powerful countries rather than seeking out the alternatives. And this is why we're going to effect change in Brazil. To the third issue, how we're going to change the politics in Brazil. Firstly, we think that if Bolsonaro does not change, we think it is very likely that Bolsonaro will not be elected in the future because he has failed his elections, because he has failed his people, because its promises are not being fulfilled, and all the other big countries are like attacking Brazil because of Bolsonaro, which means the future candidates are more likely to be environmentally friendly, are more likely to implement environmental policies as well. But also, we think that this empower environmental activists as well, because now they have allies from other countries and they have like support from the international community to say, actually, we should care about the environment, and actually Bolsonaro is wrong. Current responses is that, oh, Bolsonaro is just going to say activists are responsible for the fire. Firstly, it is that factually not true. If you support the environment, how are you going to be responsible for the fire? Secondly, we think that when the powerful nations say to all the international community, we stop trading because of Bolsonaro, or we stop trading because of these policies, it is very hard for Brazil to reiterate this fake news and be like environmental activists are responsible, which means Brazil's media are less likely to say this, or at least they have a counter view from the Western countries. And the current next response is that, oh, Western interference. Firstly, this is not just Western interference, this is also a predator coming from Argentina, coming from South America, coming from China, which means this is like a mix of countries, and it is very hard for Bolsonaro to say it is just like Western interference. And secondly, its current claims that Brazil currently listens to Argentina, which means by extension, Brazil is going to listen to China, Brazil is going to listen to US and other neighboring countries as well, which means, yes, actually, sorry.
You can't just create environmental reform out of thin air. It requires large investments of capital and technology that Brazil doesn't currently possess. If it can't sell its agricultural products in an open market at a higher price, where does that money come from?
We think that firstly, obviously, other future candidates are going to run on the environmental platforms because they can get support from the people, and also the current environmental activists are going to have power to advocate for these policies as well, which means these people will be responsible to do the policy research and will be responsible to coming up with environmental policies. Also, if we diversify economy from agriculture to services, which means we can use the money from the services industry to go back to the agriculture to implement more environmental friendly policies as well, which means we can have the money. What this means is that we're going to change Brazil's policies in the long term to make it more environmentally friendly. But also, lastly, on the trading partners, we think it is in the interest of the trading partners to do so, even to give aid to Brazil as well. Firstly, because Amazon is really important to agriculture on the earth, and Amazon is very unique compared to other environmental issues. It's just because it's literally the oxygen depends on Amazon, which means these countries are more likely to offer aid to Brazil when they see Brazil is making an active effort to change its policies, which means the money can actually come from other countries as well. So at the end of this debate, we're the side that can save the environment, we're the side that can change the Brazil's politics in the long term for the good. Very happy to affirm.
That's sort of
As Kevin tells you in a POI, reform takes time, reform takes money, it takes technology that Brazil maybe does not have right now but could potentially develop into the future. It does not make sense to rob them of the resources and to rob them of the pressures that exist right now, to push them in that direction, and to rely on kind of incentives of Bolsonaro that are almost entirely fabricated by this government to change that. When we give you reasons why that is likely to change already, it is not enough for them to just be like, well, if we tell them we're not going to trade with them, they will automatically change. That was untrue. A few things in this speech. Firstly, quickly on the principle of imperative. So I have a couple of responses to this. Firstly, I think it kind of doesn't make sense to kind of punish the people who are the ones who obviously feel the harms most acutely of this economic downturn, who are not the ones primarily liable to this, especially when these countries know that those people are living under Bolsonaro, who is not likely to respond in the way that you think and is likely to just harm those people even more. That doesn't make any sense. But secondly, to the extent that a lot of the harms or kind of the economic circumstances of Brazil are to some extent caused by colonial influences and things like that, a sweeping, non-specific general punishment is not necessarily appropriate. The final thing to note is maybe, although not wholly, I think this principle is to some extent at least contingent on whether or not they are actually able to then help the environment. We tell you they cannot, we tell you we can do it better. So why can we do it better? Why won't their model change anything? Note the existing corporate and neighbouring country incentives that we tell you about at Kevin still stand at this point in the debate. What do we hear from OG? They tell us Bolsonaro cares about economic productivity and therefore will respond to that pressure to be re-elected, or will just not be re-elected. Both of those are a good thing. we give you a few responses. Firstly, we tell you because the harm is most acutely felt by ordinary people, the politicians kind of surrounding Bolsonaro have no immediate desire to act based on this necessarily, but also it actively emboldens, as we tell you, the anti-climate rhetoric that Bolsonaro is using right now to remain in power and to feed those kinds of narratives. Although they tell you, well, Bolsonaro was actually elected on his platform of economic growth and now it'll look like he failed his people. Obviously that is not the way. He's not going to let the narrative spin that way. The narrative is going to be, look, I told you Western intervention and kind of an undermining of Brazil from within is what is causing all of these problems, which is the actual platform that he ran on, and kind of it will feed directly into the narrative that, for instance, the left-wing government is like beholden to the West and Western interests and things like that. This obviously strengthens that narrative even more. And we also tell you, because this is likely for the very reasons they give us to cause a short-term economic downturn, it is likelier that the immediate response then is to cut economic regulations or, prevent them from coming into place even more, because as we tell you, those things are costly. The response that makes sense is not to respond to economic downturn by putting into place policies that do not have immediate economic return. That obviously doesn't make sense, not only to the politicians, but it is not something that is likely to be politically popular, so it does not seem like a sensible move for them to make. In fact, what it is instead likely to do, as we tell you from Kevin to no response, is that it is just likely to justify the strongman policy and the scapegoating kind of tactic that Bolsonaro is already using. They then tell us, well, maybe in the absence of that, instead pro-environment candidates will be elected, which is a good thing. Firstly, the response is just like, no. For the reasons we tell you, this is not likely to weaken Bolsonaro's platform in any sense. It is likely to directly feed into that. People want someone to blame. If you are suffering economic downturn, Bolsonaro is good at doing that. But even if we were to accept that maybe we could then, in the next term, kind of elect a pro-environment candidate, because you have obviously left them with scraps of an economy from doing this policy, and they do not have the resources, they have even less resources than they have in the status quo. It is unlikely that those pro-environment candidates, even if they were elected, will be likely to institute kind of pro-environmental policy that is powerful or effective in any sense. That just seems worse to me, because again, that feeds into the exact same narrative that those kinds of governments are incapable, that those kinds of governments only care about Western interests and not about the needs of the people. If they cannot successfully implement those policies, it does not make sense to me why it is good for them to be elected and simply look terrible and kind of swing back right into what we had before. This will not change anything, because the pressures will simply, the pressures maybe will be applied but are misdirected, and they will just manifest in different consequences. Why though does this also make things actively worse? The only thing that OG kind of tells us that Brazil will do in the absence of this is they will move to the service industry. But as we tell you at Kevin, it is unclear where the money for that is coming from. The structures currently are poorly set up. Things like educational systems obviously are kind of the real reason why that service industry is underdeveloped. That is unlikely to suddenly change just because of this policy. We tell you instead that Brazil is likely to supply the same stuff to other countries that have worse incentives or do not have the good incentives that current countries and trading partners have, as opposed to in the status quo, for instance, that South American countries that directly have, kind of an incentive to care about what happens to the Amazon, and say the US and China, which is now much increasingly beholden to things like conscientious consumers and things like that. It is hard to diversify your economy. The obvious alternative that Bolsonaro will go to is not to then kind of try to restructure the economy and diversify that. It is to use existing infrastructure and just trade with other partners. That obviously makes more intuitive sense. Here's the problem with that though. It means that you will have to cut prices necessarily, because you are now supplying to a limited pool of countries, and they know that, so you will obviously have to sell for a lower price, and those countries are likely to be more exploitative because they are aware of the fact that Brazil now has limited options. That just means, as I tell you, you rob them of more capital, and capital is what is urgently needed right now to actually manifest the existing incentives into technology and resources that they need to meet those kinds of natural incentives. When you remove existing good incentives and you remove the ability by continuing to trade with them of exerting some level of pressure through things like continued negotiation, which you can only do if you are trading with them, or things like foreign companies applying their own standards to Brazilian companies because those are the standards they need to meet to sell back to consumers in their countries. When you remove those mechanisms, when you remove those incentives, things obviously get worse. I'll take one from closing if you have one.
Do you value faster economic growth over the survival of the Amazon?
No. Well, no. Okay, I don't know what that question was. So what we are saying is obviously the Amazon is important. We want to fix it. Our whole case is that this will not do that, and it will actively, not only will it not fix the Amazon, it also stunts economic growth. Both of those things are harms. We have two harms. that is a net harm. Okay, so what happens is not only do you remove those incentives, but you also cut off the long-term ability of Brazilian companies to reform, because as we tell you from Kevin, incentives exist in the status quo. They just do not have the resources for the technological development to actually actualize those incentives. While they say, no, this won't happen because other countries won't want to trade, like smaller countries won't trade with Brazil. This is untrue for true reasons. Firstly, smaller countries and weaker countries are obviously more beholden to their financial pressures, and as we tell you, because goods are likely to be sold for cheaper now, their primary incentive will be to get those cheaper goods and trade with Brazil. But also there is nothing, it is just asserted that these countries would prioritize some sort of abstract backing of US-China policy moves. Like, it is unclear why those countries care most about backing the US and China in the abstract rather than feeding their own people for a cheaper price. At the end of this opening half, here's what we've proved to you. Incentives exist. The problem is we are just lacking resources to actualize them. They rob them of that power. That is why we're listening today.
Henry Beston once said, "Remote from universal nature and living by complicated artifice, man in civilization surveys the creature through the glass of his own knowledge, and therefore sees a feather magnified and the whole picture distorted. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves. And therein we err, and greatly err. For the animal shall not be bettered by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have never lost nor never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings, they are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of earth." There are 2 million species of this great virtue that exist in the Brazilian Amazon. Every month, under these guys' system, which is the status quo, more of them perish. Our world becomes a more homogenous and less beautiful place. Yes, maybe Brazil's economy is going to be fucked. Obviously doesn't matter, because Brazil is just one country within one species. There are trillions of them. and literally, like, I'm sorry, you guys shouldn't be laughing. Like, neither opening team can progress to the grand final because they deal with such a small stakeholder, and our impacts win the debate. No, I'm going to deal with your mechanistic stuff about how you don't think the Amazon would be destroyed. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is deal with opening opposition and see why, yes, stopping all trade of the stuff that destroys the Amazon would protect the Amazon. So their mechanism is super flawed. It's as follows. Existing trade partners care lots about environmentalism, and those trade partners will go away, and so other trade partners will pop into existence and then buy the exact same amount of stuff. Wrong for 3 reasons. Firstly, the existing trade partners don't care very much about environmentalism. Half of Americans don't believe in climate change. Trump just pulled out of the Paris Accords. Even Obama barely did shit all. And Argentina, the only country rich enough in South America to reasonably discriminate based on environmentalism rather than price, is entering a sovereign debt crisis, which means it's likely to get a lot more discriminatory. But secondly, and here's where their case entirely falls out of the debate, they misunderstood the topic. The topic wasn't existing major purchasers of specific products that are grown in the Amazon would stop buying those products. It was all trade partners with Brazil. Brazil's a really big country. It trades with almost every other country in the world, especially if there are examples like Russia, right? Like Russia and Brazil are both in BRICS. They trade heaps. Russia's part of this debate. So what you're left with, thirdly, is just a very small number of countries buying. And even if they're very unscrupulous, it's just way less damage to the Amazon for obvious numerical reasons. Which is then why their next layer of analysis doesn't make any sense, because they're like, oh, there are corporate incentives to be good under the status quo, and there'll be backlash to these sanctions, which means we'll get less environmental regulation. But it doesn't matter, because you don't have to regulate an industry that doesn't exist, right? Like, if there's a few people hacking a few trees for the domestic Brazilian market, which is a tiny percentage of the global market, then who cares how badly they do it right compared to a much, slightly better but much bigger industry. But also, just one more mechanism, guys. The only reason we buy timber from Brazil is because they do it so unscrupulously, right? That's why it's competitive on global markets, because they destroy the rainforest in order to get it to us. If you have to plant the trees and do it in an environmental way, no one buys them. So at the end of that, clearly at the end of the opening half, you get radically less destruction of habitats on our side. in telling you why that matters, I'm going to win the debate. But first, what was it you wanted to say, Kev? I just proved it. Cool. That's right. You guys are great. Okay, so our extension. Why the destruction? And you're going to learn a new word in this one. Why the destruction of the Amazon accounts to xenocide, the destruction of entire species, and why the international community's failure to act in this instance therefore means complicity in that greatest possible of crimes. Firstly, animals have an equal claim to life as humans do. In fact, humans are animals, and also animal suffering is of equal moral consequence as human suffering. Because the only consistent way of assigning rights to beings is to look, do you have a subjective experience of the universe? Do you have things you find pleasant and unpleasant? If so, we should care about your interests. Any mechanism for discriminating about whose interests we care more about is just when you boil down to it, fascism, right? We used to think, no, but it is, right? We used to think that women were less important, they could be property of men. And then we're like, oh no, maybe even if they're a little bit different to men, they're probably not, but even if they're a little bit different, we shouldn't do that, right? Analogies apply and apply. And even in cases where the being is substantively different in their experience of the universe. For example, people with disabilities that mean that they have much less capacity to interact with their environment, we still, even if their intelligence was comparable on objective scales to an animal, we would still say you have equal moral claims. We're out of time, they're closing.
The Bible teaches us that we can eat many animals, and that is obviously because there is a difference in moral importance. Notwithstanding the sheer contingency of this.
No, the Bible was written by people to dominate other people's minds in slave-holding societies. The Bible bad, universal ethics of egalitarianism good. Honestly. So, all creatures are equal before us and before the Lord, or whatever. Put yourself in the skin of an Amazonian water bird who watches her young consumed by flames, who sees her own feathers singed as her home is permanently destroyed. But even if you don't care about those people, talk about the indigenous people that these guys kind of mentioned but then failed to impact. These people are people with ancient cultures and relationships with their environment that have sustained for millennia, while we just destroy everything we fucking touch because capitalism is awful. These people too die for the mechanisms I've given. We think that continuing to trade with Brazil is analogous to continuing to trade with fascist dictatorships while they're committing human rights abuses. It's not offensive, it's just true. And what's their worst case? It's no, Brazil's going to have a recession, people aren't going to have jobs. Boo-hoo! Their economy relies on murdering animals. It's bad. We don't care. And their other responses are oh, maybe we should have some regulation in the future and do it slow. No, it can't be gradual because every day enough more animals die, and also we're reaching a tipping point where the Amazon will be uninhabitable and fires beget fires and everything is fucked. And the Kev's response is then defeatist, which is to say, as I said before, someone else will just buy it. So because there are other trade partners. I've already told you why that's not mechanically true in the debate, but also this principle is non-contingent, okay? So even if somebody else was going to buy the wood carving that's made out of the habitat of an Amazonian water bird, you should not hang that water bird's home on your wall for fun, okay? It's crass, it's callous, it's evil. We cannot participate in it. We win the debate.
If Indonesia is just as bad as Brazil in the sense that they unsustainably forest and log all the resources in that area, we would just apply the same principle to them. Because our argument is a principle case, which means that if they break the same principle, we do the same action. That's how it works. Three things in this debate. Firstly, the fact this is xenocide. Secondly, do we protect the Amazon? And thirdly, what is in the economic interests of Brazil? Firstly, this is xenocide. We need more actual rebuttal to whether this principle is stood or not, and not just telling us that you can't protect the Amazon. We told you things like animals have an equal claim to life because they have subjective experience of the world, but also we told you that even if they're not equal, right? Even if they're an 1,000th of a human, or maybe a 10,000th of a human, or maybe an 1,000,000th of a human in worth, if you kill 20 million species, you're equivalently just killing 20 races of humans. It's just no matter how minuscule you want to reduce their life to, you're killing 20 million species. there is some sort of moral impact there. If you give them any form of significance, if you give them any form of life, you ought to care about the Amazon and the species that live there. This was obviously much more important than money. Money is something that you could get anywhere. You can get from any other part of the world. Brazil isn't the only economy that works. We can still get money elsewhere. And that was really, really important to consider, right? You can't just like sweep these things under the rug because they're animals. You can't just sweep them over because there's money in the room. Money's obviously less important. At the end of that issue, they needed to respond. The second issue and the more important issue was, do we actually protect the Amazon? OG comes out and tells us there exist these political pressures to stop, and there's like these corporate pressures to like stop, and therefore it's okay because we can just wait for this long march. We gave you 3 responses. Firstly, it's clearly not working. Maybe there are some individuals out there like Kevin believe that the Amazon is actually the lungs of the earth, but like most don't think that. Most just think money is the worry of the universe, which is the reason why they're still burning the Amazon. It's the reason why the government sanctions these things, because they do care about the money. They don't care about the fact that the Amazon is the lungs of the universe. So it means that it requires a complete cut of the demand that guarantees that the supply follows and also drops. This doesn't look like, oh, we'll just wait a while like CEO said. No, it looks like, did you know that all our trading partners just told us they're not going to buy our logs? Quick, call them, we need to stop cutting those logs because those are wasting our resources. Like, they're not just going to keep cutting logs and just hope that they stop buying, they keep buying them, right? They're going to consider the fact that it costs them money to cut down those logs. It costs them money to invest in capital that allows them to cut that stuff faster. It just means that like, they're obviously going to stop straight away. We then told you that it is necessary to immediately stop that. So even if this weird political pressure was somewhat effective, which we told you isn't, it would take a while. And obviously, we already told you analysis on why immediately stopping this was essential. We gave you 3 reasons. We told you that every single day another acre was cleared or another acre was burned. We told you that every single day a species was destroyed or another part of an individual's group's garden was destroyed. And we also told you that there was a point of no return that we're reaching, in the sense that like there are these ecosystems that depend on each other, and if you destroy like half of the Amazon, the part that depends on things that were in that part of the Amazon now break down. That ecosystem is not as good as it was before. Those ecosystems can never be recovered, in the sense that they were like developed over millions and millions of years. You don't just have Amazons all over the earth. Like, it's a very unique phenomenon that only happens in that location. So in the end of that point, it was clear that there was a necessity for an immediate stop. We were the ones that provided that immediate stop by just saying where every single trade partner is going to stop buying those things. And we told you that we did it faster and more effectively. Then CEO comes out and tells us, oh, well, there will always be trade, because trade will inevitably always exist. We told you in a POI that I guarantee you that the black market is always going to be smaller than the legal market, i.e. if you made all drugs legal, I guarantee you that legal open market is going to be much larger than the black market that exists, no matter how big that black market is. But we also told you that drugs were different to cattle and logs, because cattle big, drugs small. It meant that it was much easier to smuggle millions and millions of dollars of cocaine. It's very, very hard to smuggle millions and millions of dollars of cattle, especially not only the fact that it's small, but also like a gram of cocaine costs $300, but like a few thousand kilos of cows only cost like, what, a few $1,000s? Like the economies of scale to mass just doesn't make sense. You wouldn't be able to smuggle 2 million cows to make the same amount of money that drugs makes. It obviously was going to happen. Then also the Indonesia stuff, we'd obviously just ban Indonesia if Indonesia was actually killing orangutans. Maybe they'll be ethical. This actually just promotes and signals to countries that we will ban you if you don't do it ethically, and therefore they will just do it ethically. Like, signaling stuff, obviously better. So at worst, right, our mechanism was still better because at least we stopped those things. So like, who cares? No. CEO then tells us there's some sort of time delay. 2 responses, it's still faster than the natural progress. Like, I don't care if there's a time delay of a few days or a few months. If that is still faster than the natural progression of political pressure, then obviously it's better. But also that political pressure still exists. So like, if it compounds, then it's even better for us. Like, if it was 3 months with political pressure, it's 2 months now because we've also added this extra pressure of economics. We then told you that, who cares about the time delay, because like, if it's the event of saving the Amazon, we don't give a shit if it's saved in 5 months, as long as it's saved in 5 months and not 10 months. We still get it faster, it's still better. Finally, this issue of economic interest, which is obviously less important, because we told you that the most important thing was saving these species. It didn't matter if Brazil was going to slow down, it didn't matter that Brazil was growing less fast or whatever. Ogo tells us that it's impossible to switch between agriculture and financial services, and they'll just go to other partners. We give you 5 main pieces of extension that address this. Firstly, there already exist other industries within Brazil, e.g. tourism and finance. Rio is a very, very hot destination. Those industries don't just have to come out of nowhere. Those things actually exist. The second thing to say is that Brazil is a very large economic power relative to most countries. It doesn't require the imports to drive other industries. the tourism industry will drive itself. That's how big countries work, right? You don't depend on these large industries to grow to other ones. They're big enough to sustain themselves. They will grow regardless. So at worst, growth was slowed, but so that's a very small harm. Like, I don't understand why that's even like comparable to the harm of like just destroying 20 million species. So it was really important to compare those harms and see that, like, in the grand scheme of things, like, Brazil growing a little bit slower was not important. But we also told you, right, it was within Brazil's interest to explore these other sustainable options, and to do that quicker was better. Because every single day that you spent more on logging equipment, or every single day that you invested money into capital that was so specialized that you could only farm the Amazon, it was more money that you were putting into a sinkhole that eventually you could not get any money out of. Because at the point in which the Amazon can't give you any more resources, or at the point in which the Amazon is completely gone, all the capital that you put into the Amazon can now no longer be taken, yeah? So the faster that we cut that source off, and the faster that we push them into the tourism industry, it means the money that they have left, they're now putting into industries that can grow. We're going to put them into tourism because, people always love travel. We're going to put them into finance because finance will always exist. They're going to put them into things that are sustainable and therefore it's better. At the end of this debate, we told you that this is genocide, and that's obviously really, really bad, and that even if they're worth nothing, if you acknowledge they have some sort of worth, we're killing so many of them that it still matters. We told you that there exists. We told you that we protect the Amazon the fastest and the best, and we told you that it was within the economic interest of Brazil to do this action. Count two.
The first thing to discuss very briefly is the principle. Now, of course, a majority of the principle is non-controversial. For example, the observation that animals exist in these places, of course, is no stunning insight. Although to deliver it with such poetry, it almost became for a single moment. It was one of those crazy things in which, like, when someone jumps so high and for a second you think they can fly? So, Mark, this moment is called the ground, by the way. So, the cool thing to say is that if this policy worsens that scenario, then trivially, like if this accelerates or worsens the state of the Amazon, obviously this principle then puts us in a moral deficit in precisely the same way that it implies. So that is the word contingent is not correct here, in the sense that it is true. Marx does describe a morally incorrect state of affairs. We are purchasing goods that come about as a result of genocide. The problem is, of course, if our course of action instead causes us to kill more animals, then we are equally doing a symmetrically, or slightly not symmetrically because it is worse, equally morally incorrect action. There's the first reason to believe this. The only thing that I would add to this, though, is that this extension oddly does narrow a fair bit of the opening half. Because the opening half is talking about a basket of considerations. They're like, well, we care about the Amazon, we also care about the economy in this place, and we also care about, sustainability in other places, and we also care about some other shit. This, I think, extension does actually do a very good job of explaining why the only worthwhile consideration in this debate is obviously the Amazon. So then the first question that you should look into your heart and ask is just like, which speaker spent the most time just talking about saving the Amazon? And the answer to that is Leah, who gave you precisely 7 minutes of it. We didn't fuck around with anything else. So in that sense, the government really does us a pretty good service in terms of finding why we are the team that is winning this debate. The second thing that I want to look at is the question, how big is how much are they still going to be able to export? Obviously, a premise that is important in this debate is that trade, to a degree, will still continue. Our opening gives you a mechanism here, which is just that there are other smaller states. Our explanation is that this will go into ways that are sort of evasive. Now, Josh's response to this is unbelievably bad, which is to say that because these things are big, you can't traffic them in the same way. It's like, you're obviously, like, the way you traffic cocaine, like, you're not putting a cow up your arse. Which is obviously, because that's not what the goal is. The way this would obviously work is you just wouldn't label the beef as being from Brazil. You would ship it to one of the states that trades with you, then you would ship it out of there, which is incidentally how, when Iran was under a total oil sanction, they were still able to export heaps of the stuff. It does kind of work, but the black market just objectively happens, and incidentally, it wasn't like Saddam Hussein got on the jet and had like a liter of Blackstream up there. They just didn't label it. That's what black market is, John. So that's why obviously the gap is quite large. This policy does not stop a majority of beef exports, does not stop a majority of soy exports. It stops some, it does not stop a majority. And that is critical in understanding the next question in this debate, which is how effective is this incentive? I've already given you the first explanation for why it is not that incentive, which is that it is not a particular... the other thing that I would say, right, is that this is very short term. And actually, the theory from opening government, when you think about it, is kind of crazy, because it is actually very difficult to track globally, logistically, where things have come from. And opening government's claim to Leo in terms of trying to rebut this has been like, well, the incentive is going to operate so fast. But actually, Brazil knows that they've got quite a while, because it's going to take a long time to develop the software and systems that are able to track this much stuff, right? So there is a substantial time lag there. So the third question then you need to ask is, of course, how effective is this sort of thing? So opening government essentially gives you two incentives. The first is the idea that the beef and soy industry will specifically be angry and they've got Bolsonaro by the nuts. And secondly, this will cause a recession and that is likely to be problematic. Both of these things are true as absolute statements. The question is the scope. We explain, in addition to that one that I previously provided, another two reasons to believe that they will not be sufficiently strong. Firstly, a substantial time gap is effective. And secondly, as a result, it is only a marginal, not an absolute cost on these things. So this is more like imposing a relatively substantial tax on these industries. It is not necessarily like imposing a ban. Given that this mitigation, they have only provided you with a modest incentive. So the question that you need to ask yourself is this incentive then sufficient to overcome the barriers that they have identified? And I think the answer to that question is no, because an alternative is available to them. So the industries that are described as the key lobbying actors in this debate now have a choice. They can either stop participating in activities that have previously generated them profits, or, which is what they believe they can do, or they can continue and accelerate doing so, expand the amount of meat that they export, and in doing so, make up the shortfall that has been imposed by this previous thing. And given this mitigation demonstrating this incentive is not sufficiently strong, we are the team that was able to correctly identify that they will follow the latter path. Josh's only response to this is to say that they have other industries, so they don't need this that much, like tourism and finance, which of course belies what tourism and finance is. Like, who puts their global headquarters for an equities trading firm in a global pariah state? You know? Like, of course, these other industries are insufficient. So then, actually, I'll take opening now.
Cool. So, OL essentially said that there'll be low prices when you sell it to other countries, and therefore, I think that gives good incentives as to why these corporations would be quick to put in the environmental protections, agricultural stuff, so they could continue actual trade and legitimacy.
So the thing is that the problem is, we're not talking about like the beef industry overall. We're talking about either, does this clear the threshold for Bolsonaro to actually like really send in the military to stop it? That's why you could do it, one. Or way you could do it two is getting the minority of land clearers who are acting illegally but with tacit government support. And group number two isn't harmed by this enough to stop doing it for the reason that Leah gives you, which is that they're able to just continue land clearing, and the amount of additional land that they make is equal to more profits than the tax that is being imposed on them by this, particularly given the very large time lag that is available to them. As a consequence of that, we explained that all of their incentives are aligned, in fact, in favour of an acceleration of the burn-off. And this is the final problem, and we give you a bunch of mechanisms, literally none of which Josh rebuts. They've gone over in extensive detail about the negotiation period, about the need for additional money, about the need to establish additional made funds so there are more members, sort of, you have more political power. The final question then to sort of ask is just, is that a harm that should be weighted appropriately? And the answer is yes. The rest of this debate has misunderstood what the harm is. Because it is not a binary question. It is not a switch of on or off. The Amazon is already burning. For a period of time, the Amazon will continue to burn. We are the only team that appropriately understands that the way that you win this debate is not by stopping that or turning it on, because it's not binary, it doesn't work that way. Instead, our mechanisms point to an acceleration of the trend. And that acceleration of the trend means that more animals die, more indigenous people die, more unrecoverable space on the land is also destroyed. Ultimately, we are the team with the most realistic conception of how the actors in this debate will behave. We're the team with the most realistic conception of what the harm in this debate is, and we're the only team that correctly ascribes to what our moral evaluations in this debate are. That is why closing opposition decisively takes the round.